Who wants to start us out? Okay, take it away. Deciding is hard. The most comforting thing I've ever heard about this came from several short sentences about writing. So he says that every book, every finished, like written piece, there's never a theoretical perfect ideal that you're heading towards. And I think as authors, when we're starting out, we expect that there's a single best version of what we're trying to write that we just need to find and get there. Klinkenborg says that's not the case. And any finished product exists within a world of alternate universes or alternate possibilities, the books it could have been. And I found that very comforting because it's like I'm not trying to find some theoretically perfect book. I'm trying to find a book that solves problems for a reader. So I'm trying to find one possibility within all of the possibilities that works, not necessarily the best one. I found that comforting because how do you evaluate? I don't know. You can't. They don't exist yet. There's no structured way to test them. Like sometimes you care about one more than you care about the other, and that's your answer. A way I heard this phrase is, am I curious enough to think about this for a year? Or am I curious enough to spend a year getting to know this particular type of reader better? Because you are going to get to know them better through beta reading, through feedback, through trying to understand and solve their problems and see where they get confused. So if there's a difference in curiosity or passion or your own motivation, to me, that's very clarifying. Um, I don't make my decision based on market size or market dynamics, but I do use that to disqualify ideas if there is no market. So if I'm looking at something, I'm like, two ideas, I'm equally excited, but one I feel has like zero market or zero growth potential, or I can't figure out any way to get it going without like doing some terribly arduous marketing task for like years. To me, that's enough to eliminate an idea, but I won't look at two ideas and pick the one based on like slightly bigger market because I've been surprised. I don't think in books it's so weird. Like the markets are not what you think they are. A niche book can grow so much bigger than its niche. You can do multiple books as well. There's a really popular small business book called The E-Myth Revisited. The extended case study in it, it's about cafes and hotels, a very service industry. And then later he wrote the same book for chiropractors. So it's like the E-Myth for chiropractors or the E-Myth for whatever, different types of businesses. And it basically is the same book with the example swapped out. And that's okay because he's not expecting someone to read like multiple different ones, right? So he's okay with 80% of the content being the same. In other cases, people write their books as real series. Like you're expected to go from one to the next to the next. Totally fine also. People don't care about the books of yours that they haven't read, right? And I think as authors, we're very obsessed with our own body of work and like, does it overlap? What's the progression? Is it consistent? But like a reader's going to take what they want from your body of work. They're not going to see all of it in the way you see all of it. So I think consistency is less critical than we tend to believe it is. And it's like, start somewhere, right? Like start with a good book somehow, right? And then you can go from there. Like, who cares what the next one is? You don't have to feel super bound by the pattern you begin now. Okay, so selling books is a hard way to make money, is where I'm going to start this. So it is very valuable to build a direct relationship with your readers somehow, which usually involves getting them out of the book and onto your website and them giving you their email so that you can then give them something valuable in return, which is often like a digital bonus, right? It's often whatever. It can be a digital workbook, it can be example videos, etc. This can be very upsetting to readers if they feel like it was withheld from the book, even though it could have been in the book. So people don't like feeling like you sold them half a product. And for the rest, they have to give you their email. That like creates very bad vibes. Also, there's many situations where they can't do that. Like they're on a plane without internet, or they're busy, or they're listening to the audiobook, or they're reading it on their Kindle while they're on the beach. There's a lot of situations where that like mixed media use case is just not viable. And so if that breaks the book or the book feels incomplete, to me that is not good. However, if it feels like a bonus, like it's something optional and extra, like the book itself still feels complete, canonical answer to what was promised on the cover. Nothing's being withheld. And the extras are extras, they're bonuses. And if it feels like there's a good reason that they're digital instead of in the book itself. So the examples you mentioned are great because it's like a detailed color photo. It is audio. It is a lot of guitar books will do this now in music books where they'll say like next to every riff there's like a QR code. It's like, hey, scan this QR code and it'll play the way it's meant to sound. Um, that's really cool. That's helpful. That's a nice addition. In Storyworthy, which there's a case study about that coming up in a week or two when we analyze reader experience. It's about storytelling and story structuring. He'll do a text version of a story, and then he'll say like, "This is the example, but if you want to hear me telling the example on stage, you know, here's the QR code and the link." So totally doable, but it's delicate, and hopefully that's clear on where it backfires versus where it feels like, wow, there's so much extra value here. And assume that not everyone's going to get those examples, so the book still needs to work without them. Um, but they're nice, and some authors find the reader relationship so valuable that they basically force it. So an example of this would be Alex Hillman, who removed his book from Amazon and only sells it through his own website because he wanted to guarantee that he gets everybody's email so that he can, and then he like follows up on the book purchase with a lot of additional like educational resources and prompts and actions and all of this. That's an extreme example. The gentle example is you just put something at the front and the back, which you say, hey, there's more. Um, in Wub, I did it by whenever I quoted someone I had interviewed, I also linked to the full interview video. Nirayal did a simple one where he wrote the book. When he was editing, he removed a couple chapters. Then he took those removed chapters, plus created a bunch of worksheets, plus some excerpts from the main book, and he made a digital workbook. The book mentions the workbook mentions the book, and he's found that they cross promote in both directions. So a lot of people will download the digital one for free first, thinking it's a summary. Then they're like, oh, wait, this book actually sounds really good. And they'll go and buy the real book. And the opposite thing happens as well. So yeah, it's cool. It's something that the modern author definitely needs to think about if you're trying to build a business on top of your book. We're going to talk about this in some depth, I think, in the fourth module, the fourth and fifth, but I'll like drop a couple quick ideas. At each stage of the book, you want to find some way that takes like 10% of your time or less of your writing time. So it's not dominating your writing time, but you want to look for some piece of your process that's stage appropriate for where the book is at that you're able to put somewhere. Um, so, and this is not necessarily going to be for building a huge audience. It's just to tell people it's like, hey, I'm still working on this. Like, hey, like this thing is happening. Um, the really low hanging fruit is you put it in your email signature where you go, hey, I'm working on a book about this. If that's your thing, here's where you can learn more, or give me early feedback, or check out an early version. I've seen some people get all of their beta readers just that, like by that, just from like individual correspondence. Um, Another way is like you share your research. So, like once per day, or whenever you use a quote or you find a research article, you ask yourself, why do I find this interesting? And then it's the quote or the excerpt or the resource, and you giving a few words about why that's interesting or relevant for this thing you're working on. If you're doing beta reading, you can use the beta reader comments as the thing you share. And you go, hey, someone was confused about this or thought this was powerful. So let me like add a little bit of extra context or clarification about that. So as much as possible, when you're doing it for just showing your work, as opposed to really trying to build a serious audience, where you're just like, I just need a trickle of beta readers, you know, like a few extra people per week is enough to keep the learnings coming in and to help me keep finding the next problem in my book so I can fix it. So you don't need tons of people, you need a few. So you're like, okay, what's a small, easy action I can do that overlaps with the work I'm already doing on my book that will just create that drip? Um, that's the way I think about it. Oh, and also on this, I'll mention individual outreach works really well. So everyone wants to use a list and use things that scale, but almost all of my books I've started by emailing people I knew and been like, hey, a while back you were talking about writing a book or running workshops. Like, is that still a thing for you? I'm like working on this thing, like, this manuscript. I've got 20 pages. Like, is it relevant? I'd love your feedback. A lot of people go, oh no, I'm past that now. But again, you only need a trickle. And that's often how I do my very first round of beta reading when I'm nervous, because I don't want to be like, my new book, tell the world. I want to like find friendly individuals who I think have the problem and are going to be very forgiving of typos and grammar and all that stuff. There is a theoretically optimal, like robot answer, which is no, you probably don't need to be writing. Like, probably there's more efficient ways to get the learning, and like a lot of those words are going to get thrown away, etc. Right? However, the realistic answer is sometimes we writing is how we figure out what we want to write. Sometimes writing is how we figure out who we really care about. Like sometimes we think by writing, you know? And so I don't do the perfectly theoretically optimal thing. I'm like pretty far in that direction, but it's not 100% because like sometimes it's nice to just write. It's like I'm writing a book. I want to write, you know? Um, and I'm okay with it taking a little bit longer if I'm like, oh, actually, those 2 weeks I spent on that bit, I didn't need to spend, but it doesn't matter. Like that's how I wanted to spend my time. It's fine. If I was up against a hard deadline, I'm like, I have to get this done by this date, or like it's a disaster. maybe I'd be a bit more mercenary with myself, but it's like, who cares? You know? And if you're able to, if you're okay with getting over the sunk cost of having to rewrite something or revise it or throw it away after you've spent some time on it, then this is way less damaging, right? And if you're not in a rush, like fine. And I found that the stuff I write is never totally wasted, even if it doesn't get into the book. At the very least, it's making my thinking better. But often I keep a cutting room floor document, and as I remove stuff from the book, I put it into the cutting room floor doc. And often that will then go out as a newsletter or a blog post or a piece of content marketing. Or later I'll realize, oh, wait, I gave a different example. Or like when I'm on the podcast book tour, I'll go to the cutting room floor to find examples that are different from the examples in the book. So I'm not repeating myself. So I never consider it waste, even when it looks like waste. But yeah, perfect world, you do your learning with like, teaching and coaching and you do all that and then you save one or two revisions later. But like it's your book, Like do what you want. So let me try to provide some context for the others. And I'll also if I'm thinking wrong, you can correct me. So Jan's book is like ice melters. It's basically picking a fight against the idea of icebreakers. And it's like icebreakers are inefficient, they're stupid, like do something else, ice melters, ice destroyers, ice nuclear bombs, whatever it's called. And then the issue, as I understand it, is that that applies to workshop facilitators, but there's also a bunch of other situations where this applies. Like people do icebreakers on the first day of school. They do them at corporate events. They do them at exec ed retreats. There's all these situations where icebreakers get used. So it's a case where the reader profile cuts across niches because there's like this icebreaker, almost like use case or sub step, and that step is in a bunch of different journeys for different types of readers. And you're like, how do I describe who this reader profile is, or how do I pick one when this is the case? So if the sub-step is the same, so if icebreakers are similar enough across all those different journeys, like let me give a different example. Um, let's say that there is some consistent logic to creating a profitable food menu, which applies to restaurants, cafes, bars, and any other kind of food business. Like designing the menu, thinking about the if that is true, then you don't need to say menu design for cafe owners. You can say like something about like menus, right? The same feels like it could be true about icebreakers if you feel they are similar enough across those different contexts. However, if you get into writing and if you find yourself having to branch every explanation into like 3 or 4 situations, so you give some piece of advice and then you go, so if you're in a classroom, you do this. If you're in a workshop, you do this. If you're at a corporate event, you do this. That's a sign that it's different reader profiles and you probably need to pick one. If you find that you can give the advice and it applies to all of them naturally, then like you're done, right? That's like a sub step that applies to a bunch of other journeys. Focus on the sub step. And then the thing to be careful of there is you don't want to accidentally let your scope creep outside of that sub step where the journeys are going to start to diverge in different directions. So if you're talking icebreakers, like the 5 minutes before the icebreaker and immediately afterwards are going to suddenly be very different depending on whether you're talking about schools or exec. So you pick your problem and you focus on it. One way to think about it also is everyone's very every product creator does this, but we get very fixated on demographics and niches because we can see the demographic and the niche. They fit in like a neat box and they're easy to define. It's like people from this industry or this demographic, whatever. But oftentimes targeting by worldviews or pains or problems is like more effective. And oftentimes the worldview or the pain or the problem will like cut across a bunch of niches and you get all of them. Oh, and then the last thing I was going to say on this. So the beginning of your book has to nail it for every possible reader because people give up very quickly at the beginning of the book. We're going to talk next week about front loading the value and reader experience. The beginning is the most important. So like the beginning has to nail it for everyone. Later in the book, you can start getting more specific on the basis that you've earned goodwill by delivering value through the first half, and you can start to give more specific advice at the end that may only apply to like a subset of readers. So that's something you can think about in your structuring as well. You're like, which piece of my advice applies to everyone and which doesn't, and then you put the more niche stuff toward the end. Okay, so for write useful books, I'll tell you about stuff that beta readers made me add and stuff that readers made me delete because it goes both directions. um, so the deletions was I originally had a bunch of stuff about royalties, like optimizing royalties and making a living, and it was like a lot of it was more banging the drum about like financial independence or passive income or that sort of thing. And I found that that was pretty alienating to authors who wanted to go the traditionally published route because they tend to have goals other than royalties. And I didn't want to exclude traditionally published because I felt like the vast majority of what I was saying would apply to both situations. So I removed a lot of stuff that was strongly resonating with self published authors. And especially like young, like financially motivated people who wanted to like get enough to quit their job or travel or that sort of thing. Um, so I removed all that stuff. Then something I added, and I really did not want to add this. I tried so hard not to add it. I was like, they won't know if it's not there. They won't notice it. Like, uh, I originally had no chapters on seed marketing or any type of marketing. I basically had one line where I was like, uh, and you're gonna have to do some seed marketing, go read other books about that. Like I was like, this book's about designing the book, it's about structuring it, it's about iterating, it's about getting feedback. Yeah, you're gonna have to do seed marketing, go Google it. Like Google content marketing. Oh man, my beta readers were not having that. And I can't like everyone was like, "You're missing the chapter on seed marketing," and I was like, "No, I'm not. It's not supposed to be there." And they're like, "Yes, it is. You're missing it." And I was like, "Ah!" So I went in and I put it in, and with great annoyance. But then they were much happier. And I tried to signpost that chapter in a way where a really experienced marketer would read the first sentence and be like, "Oh, I can skip this chapter." And so that they wouldn't get annoyed at me. So I tried to like signpost that pretty clearly. Another problem I had with Write Useful Books in particular, it was the way it was originally structured. People would get up to about the beta reading chapter, and then they'd go, "Oh, I need to have a manuscript. I'll come back to this in 6 months." And so all of my beta readers were stopping halfway because they're like, "This was amazing. I'll be back in 6 months to read the rest." I was like, "No, like I need you to read the whole thing because like it changes the way you write it if you're thinking about like the marketing and the beta reading and all of that." And so a lot of my final rounds of beta reading were basically trying to solve that problem. And I ended up having to remove, I had more writing advice, I had more notes about putting together your draft. And I found that that was what was causing people to abandon because they got into this writing advice and they're like, "Oh, I need to write the thing now." And so then they'd stop reading. And in the end, I was like, well, it's not my unique competence. It's not my core insight here. So I don't mind cutting that. And when I did, and I'm just like, okay, you're going to like, I signposted what was coming up. I did some hooks and transitions, and people started reading the whole thing in one go, which is what I wanted. I don't think that's necessary for every book, but that's what I did. Not necessarily. So some authors within the community have done this. I never have. And the results have been mixed. Some authors do seem to be really happy with the insights they get back. It seems to work better if they have incredibly detailed, descriptive titles and subtitles, where it's almost like a full outline of learning outcomes. And it also seems to work better if they're targeting more experienced, more expert level readers who kind of understand what everything's going to be about and like and can imagine better what the manuscript is. There's been other cases where it's just not useful at all, or like people can't imagine, or they say like something polite or something mean for arbitrary reasons because it's like very fluffy feedback. One way of doing it that I kind of like is if you saw these chapters, which three would you want to most read and which three would you least want to read, for example? So if you can kind of specify like a yes, no, you like force some positive and some negative. Uh, Again, I don't do it because I'm like, I'm suspicious and it doesn't feel like the best. But what I do is I have my table of contents whenever I can. And I will try to like use that almost as a structure of learning outcomes for either a coaching conversation or an actual workshop or some other version of becoming the book. So, like, if I sit down, like when I was writing all my books, but for Write Useful Books, for example, I actually started with reader conversations before I had, well, I had like a 10-page, here's some advice. And I started doing reader conversation. I'm like, you're writing a book. Let me try to help you. Like, let's get a coffee and I'll just like ask me questions. And in there, if they had questions, I'd be happy to talk through questions. But oftentimes they're like, so what should I do? And then I would take out my piece of paper, which was basically the table of contents. And I'd be like, okay. And I would kind of use that to structure. I'd take some piece of it, a chapter or two chapters, and I'm like, why don't we talk about this first? And I try to like teach them that bit. And I used it as almost my outline or my guide to keep me on track. And then based on what they said and where they got confused and where they got excited and where they got bored and changed the topic, I would take notes on my printed out table of contents. And I'm like, okay, I need to add better examples here. I need to reorder this because they see this as a tedious slog. So that's how I use the table of contents. I combine it with like becoming the book or teaching or coaching, not with direct, tell me what you think about this table of contents. One thing I did do, I was working on a book before my son was born and I was kind of up against the deadline. I ended up putting it on ice because I couldn't get it finished in time. But I, when I wanted to do beta reading, I'd only written like 3 chapters. And so after the 3 chapters, I felt like they understood the context. And I was like, by the way, here's what I'm planning to write to complete this book. And I put the rest of the table of contents at the end of the beta reading. And that actually I did get really good feedback on because they were already 10,000 words into it. They had enough context and they were able to be like, I need this, and they were like highlighting individual sections and they're like, send this to me first. So that kind of helped me. If I had been in a position to continue working on the manuscript, I would have found that quite helpful. So these are my 3. You can see that the mom test and write useful books are shorter. And workshop survival guide was a bit thicker. There was more that had to go in there. So mom test, the pink one, is the shortest. That's just over 30,000 words. And the page count is about 130 pages. But that feels like a book. When people get this, they're like, it's a short book, but it still feels like a book. And Write Useful Books was maybe 35,000 words. It's a little bit longer. And I think Workshop Survival Guide was 60,000, something like that. To me, I, books feel short if they're below like 120 pages. Below 100 pages, it feels suspiciously short. Like people get it and they're like, what is this? It feels like a magazine. It's about 200 or 250 words per paperback page, something like that. So call it 250 words. So 4 pages per 1,000 words. Is that right? 30,000 words, 4 pages, 120. Yeah, that's about right. If you don't get too creative with your typography or layout. So I don't like padding out a book with extra words, but I'm very okay with padding it out with like visual examples or creative typography and layout or like extra illustrations. Not in a deceptive way. Like you can't write a blog post and then add 1,000 illustrations to it. But if you're like, what people need is 80 pages long, like just in their hand, 80 pages doesn't feel like a book. So then you go like, okay, what are my options here? And another thing you can do there is you can add detailed examples, but make them visually skippable. So you can either change the typography or put them in call out boxes. And if you make stuff visually skippable, it doesn't slow down the reader experience in the same way. Because then if people don't want that extra level of detail, they can just jump ahead. That doesn't work in an audiobook. The audiobook is where that gets tricky. A book can be as long as you want, though, by the way. A really long book is totally fine as long as the value is front loaded and the value is regular. Like you want value to be arriving every few pages. It can be as long as you want it. Like I'll read a 1,000-page book if it keeps giving me value, but I won't read 50 pages of a slog that I feel like I didn't sign up for as a reader. So, as long as it needs to be, but no longer. You will eventually want to hire help. So I recommend that almost everyone hire a proofreader, which is only a few $100s, and they deal with all the typos and the sentence level stuff. That's like the final thing you do. A copy editor is sentence and paragraph level interventions. And there you're looking at a little bit more, 1,000, maybe. It depends. But they're not doing anything structural. So a developmental editor is structural. You are probably past that because you've already got something that's working for beta readers. So a developmental editor is a real expensive luxury. It's kind of like a book coach. It's someone who's with you throughout the whole journey. They are amazing. It's really fun to write with someone else in the manuscript who's paying as much attention to it as you are. And you can talk through big revisions and all of that. But that takes a lot of hours and that gets really expensive. I did that for one of my books, but not the other 2. I found that I get the same insights if I'm patient through beta reading. So me plus beta readers, I get the developmental, the structural insights. But then after that, I'm like, okay, copy editor and proofreader, cost effective, save me a bunch of hours. I like that. There's a website called Reedsy, REEDSY.com. And basically, as the book industry has crumbled, all of the previously full-timers from the book industry have gone freelance. And so Reedsy is a marketplace, but only of vetted publishing industry professionals who now freelance. So you can go get someone out of like Penguin, and you can like build your own dream team. That's where I find all of my book professionals. Somewhere in the community resources, Brian can dig up the link. There is a kind of checklist of all the final tasks of self-publishing and polishing. These are all the things you need to think about and worry about. And on that checklist, you'll find options. You'll find the do-it-yourself option. You'll find the hire a professional to help you out. You can rush the whole polish and publication thing in like a month, but it's pretty stressful to do it. The natural pace is more like 3 months. If you still want to do like big revisions, big rewrites, and cost is not an issue, you might decide to get a developmental editor. And what you would do then is you overlap the developmental editor's advice with rounds of beta reading so that you're not just trusting one person's opinion, but it's an expert's opinion complemented by what your readers are experiencing. Okay, so some piece of theory. Okay, so think of a parable. Like if I say sour grapes, and you've heard the sour grapes story, like sour grapes like carries a lot of meaning, a lot of payload, right? Because it's got the whole story of the parable behind it. But the first time, I can't just go to someone who's never heard the parable and be like sour grapes, like because they don't get it. In some cases, theory and background information and context is the same way. It's like telling the parable the first time. It helps people to believe the advice or to believe the lesson. So the way I think about it, it's not that all theory is bad. It's that trying to get it all out of the way just because it's organizationally convenient is bad. Um, there's some amount that's going to be necessary for them to understand and believe what you're telling them to do. They're like, oh yeah, I get why this matters. I get why this is important. There's some important context potentially. Um, that's not a bad thing. Like it's not like every book needs to start as a checklist of like just do these 20 things and your problems are solved. Like people aren't just going to follow a bunch of random advice with no context in it. This is something if you listen to the podcaster Andrew Huberman, he does these like 3-hour podcasts where he goes into the neuroscience and the background, and then at the end he's like, "So start your day by looking at sunlight." And it takes him 3 hours to get there, right? Because he wants to talk about the brain mechanisms. But because he's talked about the brain mechanisms, people believe his advice. Whereas when their mom was like, you should really get outside, they're like, nah, mom, you don't get it. Right. Like, so that's a case where some amount of theory has allowed them to understand value and take the advice. Um, but I see a lot of authors who are like, I'm going to give you all the theory first just because it's convenient for me. And they haven't really been thoughtful about which bits of theory are necessary to support which actions or which bits of usefulness. In some cases, context can also be valuable, like directly, like at the beginning of Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. He kind of spends a while explaining why traditional negotiation advice is wrong in certain situations. There's no action there. You can't do anything better because of that, but it is an insight. It's something you read that and you go, wow, I see the world more clearly now. Like I understand something about myself and the world that I didn't understand before. You can't do the whole book like that, or that's like a pop book, which also is fine. It's just, a different genre. But like, fine. Like your readers will show you where the value is, and it's not always where you expect. Um, if your beta readers aren't reaching the end, I wouldn't ship it off for polish and pre-publication yet, because before I do that, I really want to see like beta readers are reaching the end. Some of them are taking action, and some of them are bringing their friends and like trying to share the manuscript with other people. If I see those three things, like they're reaching the end, they're taking some action, and they're bringing friends, then I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to move on to the polish and pre-publication. What else? We got a few more minutes here. Yeah. Oh man, I wish I knew. I have so many ideas. I was listening to a conversation the other day with oh my gosh, man, my name recollection is just awful. Rick Rubin, the music producer, and the fellow was asking him like how many projects he's abandoned, or like how he decides to abandon a project, because he does so much all at once. He's always got a million projects going on. And his answer really struck me. He's like, I've never abandoned a project. It's just some of them haven't been finished yet, or the time's not right for them, And I was like, huh. And I would like to embrace that attitude with books as well. Cause I mean, I'll tell you, there's so many books I would love to write at some point. But then I'm like, whew, like for me to do this properly, I don't want to just churn out piles of words. I want to, get to know the readers. I want to make sure it works. I want to make something that's going to grow and have value and have an impact. So I'm like, okay, that can't happen that fast. There's work that goes into that. So like, I probably can't write all of these, but that's okay. I was also quite struck by, I was talking to Nir Eyal, who wrote Hooked and Indistractable, and we were talking about his new book. I was like, I talked to him, then I talked to him like 6 months later and was like, how's your new book coming? And he's like, oh, it's in the same place. I was like, yeah. Oh, is everything okay? Are you worried? Like, what's going on? He said, his answer was so striking. He says, my daughter's growing up. She's a teenager. I can't spend like all my time writing books. So I've decided that a book takes me 5 years. And that's a pace where, this is his words. He's like, that's a pace where I can work on a book without any stress. and like still like, enjoy the family and enjoy life and be there and all that. So for him, the answer was just like pick a pace, right? And be like, okay, that's the pace I can do this at that fits into my life. And I got to say, when I'm working on my books, I am very stressed out. And he seemed very relaxed and happy. So maybe he's onto something. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you soon. Happy writing.